Are you a blogger trying to figure out how to interpret the data in your Google Search Console graph? In today's video, I'm going to show you actual screenshots from my own Google Search Console, or GSC, graphs from my portfolio of websites, and use these examples to help you better understand your site's own data. My name is Casey, and I'm the founder of bloggingguide.com. There are many types of trends, insights, and data that you can draw from your Google Search Console graph data. But the four main types of trends that I see and I think are useful for other bloggers to understand are the following. First, there's brand new sites. And sometimes, because these sites are usually between 0 and 3 months of age, sometimes they're not getting any clicks. So it's basically just going to be a flat line. You're going to be at 0. But toward the end of that period, hopefully by month 3 or 4, you're getting some level of clicks. So we'll go through some examples of some of my sites that are in this 0 to 3 month time frame and see sort of what their click data looks like and some of the things you might look for to gauge your own progress. The second type of trend is what I call when a site reaches escape velocity. This is during months, typically 4 to 12. Not exclusively, this can happen later. In fact, sometimes this takes 18 to 24 months to happen, but usually it occurs in that 8 to 12 month range. Or if you are really growing a site fast, or maybe you're using lots of AI content or something unusual, you're buying lots of links or doing something to boost your rankings, you'll see this as early as month 4. And basically, this just means that the graph is doing a nice up and to the right pattern, and you're not ever having 0 click days. So in the example, you can see the graph is kind of at the beginning, it looks kind of like the brand new site graph. It's oscillating between 0 and 2 to 3 clicks a day. And then at some point, it sort of leaps up to 10, 20, and then almost as much as 70 clicks per day at various points. There's still fluctuations, and it's not clear that this will continue going up. It's definitely not a stable, steady site yet, but it's clear that this site has some momentum, and Google's starting to show it to people in the search results. The third type of trend are stable sites. And these are basically, they're not always, but they're typically sites that are at least 12 months old. It's not that you can't have younger sites that are stable. You definitely can. But if you're actively adding content, typically there's going to be growth in your site and you'll see some sort of upward trajectory that'll look similar to the previous scenario. This is a site that I basically have in maintenance mode. And as you can see, the traffic fall is actually a very clear pattern. Each of those curves represents 1 week, with the peak being, in my case, usually Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday, and the weekends being sort of the low point for each of those waves. And you can even see that while generally that pattern holds pretty true right around Christmas, there is a dip. And so I included this example during this time frame for this very reason, because a site can be totally stable and still experience seasonal fluctuations. All sites are susceptible to different holidays, world events, anything that dramatically alters internet usage. So, and your site itself might actually be a seasonal niche. So that's something worth keeping in mind, that this is an example of a stable site, even though you do see a noticeable drop here once, basically 1 or 2 weeks out of the 3-month rolling period. And then the fourth type of trend are basically Google updates. So these are algorithmic updates that either boost your site typically or harm your site, lower the traffic. This usually is something like a 20 to 30% increase or decrease, but it could be as much as 60 to 80%. These can vary in how they look, and but generally your traffic's not literally going to zero. That's the next sort of sub case here, and that's if you have a manual penalty. And if you have a manual penalty, you'll actually see that under the manual security section in your Google Search Console. But if you have a penalty, your traffic will actually go pretty much to zero and stay there because it's no longer being indexed, and Google Search Console only reflects the data from clicks in Google search. So even if you're getting traffic from social media or direct traffic, maybe you have a business and people are going directly to your website because they're a repeat customer, you won't see any of that data reflected here. And usually for these to happen, your site needs to be at least 6 months old. If you're doing something sketchy with links or spamming AI content or doing anything else that's kind of black hat, maybe this will happen before 6 months. But generally speaking, site traffic tends to, grow pretty steady for the first, year almost or so. So if it's less than 6 months, doesn't mean your site got hit by an algorithm update. You need to actually go in and check what event occurred during that time or what changes you may have actually made to your site. Here we have the first category of sites, and that's brand new sites. So this site was created sometime at the beginning of December 2023, I believe, and the data runs through today, which is the end of the first week of March. So as you can see, it's only received 11 clicks during this time. It has a fairly low click-through rate of 0.1%. And in general, while I use click-through rate personally as a major indicator for whether to continue with a site or not, the one exception I want to note throughout this video is that if a site is in these first 3 months, I'm not that picky about the click-through rate. If you see a high click-through rate, you might have stumbled across some really great topics, found some real hidden gems. That's great. But this doesn't really mean enough yet. All I know with this site is that basically a few of the posts are indexed, and there's some chance this will be a site that I'll continue working on. It's not particularly promising. Most brand new sites aren't. And again, you could still have to wait another 3 months. So it wouldn't be till month 6 sometimes before you even see that first click. So you shouldn't write off a site just because it doesn't have any clicks. But if it's getting impressions at all, after months 4 through 6, generally you want to see, uh, you know, some level of clicks, a few per month. Um, Really, you want to get closer by month 6 to at least a click a day, as we'll show in some of the next examples. So this is a site that basically I haven't gotten rid of yet, but if it doesn't improve in the next month or two, it'd probably be on the chopping block. And here we have 2 more examples. So these are also sites from my portfolio. As you can see, these sites were launched around the same time, basically. They all started basically in December, and the data runs through early March. So you can see they kind of look a little bit different. The graph on the top shows 56 clicks total during this 3-month period. It has a 0.5% click through rate, so it's a little better than the other one, but still not that great. I generally don't pay attention to average position, by the way. It's really a very deceptive measure. The main thing you should focus on are clicks and your click-through rate, which by default takes into account impressions. But as you can see, this site's getting clicks about every other day. It has plenty of still 0 click days. You can see that alternating spiky pattern in there, but you can see that the impressions kind of aren't spiking, which actually is probably good in this case, meaning Google's not feeding your content and sort of sending it out in mass, and people aren't rejecting it in mass. So if you saw that purple line start to wildly spike up and your content still only got 1 or 0 clicks a day, that's an indication to both you and Google that, you basically your content's not being received well by your audience. The graph below shows another site that I believe was started actually the same day. So all 3 of these sites, the one on the previous slide, and then these 2 were launched on the same day. So this has the most clicks in total of the sites. It has 294. It's slightly better with a 0.7 click-through rate. And this one has 0 days, but you can see that on the non-0 days, it hits at the beginning 2 or 3, and toward the end more like 4 or 5 clicks. In fact, there's a few days toward the end of February and early March where there's actually no 0 days. So this site is showing some progress. And I think that of these 3 graphs I've shown you so far, this one on top with 56 clicks is probably sort of the minimum of what you want to see. This is a good indication that your site is starting to index. This doesn't mean your site will be a wild success. It just means that it's getting traction in a reasonable amount of time. If your graph looks something more like the bottom graph, you're actually probably in a better position. This means that, yes, you're still essentially getting the same click-through rate, but there's a little bit higher volume typically for what you're going after. So between these 2 graphs, obviously the 294 clicks would be preferable, and it has a better click-through rate. But really what that's just reflecting is probably the topic, and knowing the niches of these 2 sites. The overall niche is bigger for the site that has 294 clicks. So this is pretty consistent with what I typically see with a new site. If you have a new site that, again, stays at 0 clicks beyond 3 months, or is still at the 1 or 0 click a day mark 6 months out, I would generally consider that site a dud. Or you targeted something too competitive, or maybe you just went way too broad. Um, Again, you need to niche down in order to rank. That's a big part of my philosophy, and all of these sites are fairly well niched down. So these are what the graphs would look like, assuming you've kept your site focused on a single niche. Now we're getting to my favorite of the 4 types of graphs. These basically are the ones that reach escape velocity, as I call it, meaning they no longer have 0 click days. So the graph is bouncing along at 0, 1, 0, 1 per day. And then basically at some point, in the case of this first graph, it looks like right around the middle of December, it basically takes off, and you can see it bounces between 5 and 10 clicks a day. And then toward February, it starts to pick up, getting 15 to 20 clicks a day. Again, there's not really much of a discernible weekly pattern here, and you always have to overlay your knowledge of what's going on. That's why it's important to stay up to date on the latest Google algorithm updates, because while there wasn't an update in here, not in the middle of this at least, but if there had been, let's say at the end of January, you could have maybe ventured that this was a site that benefited from an update. But since there were no publicly announced updates during this period, I would say this is a pretty standard case of reaching escape velocity. And this is kind of the minimum of what I'm looking for before I really start adding more content to a site beyond the initial posts that I seed it with. So now we have two more sites that I would classify as having reached escape velocity. These sites now are starting to get, in a 3-month period, generally over 1,000 clicks. So the one on top here has a little under 2,000 clicks for the 3-month period. And you can see that sometime around basically the beginning of the year, maybe, early January is when it sort of started growing significantly day to day, and you basically don't see any more 0-click days for the next 2 months. And that trend, it's starting to become discernible, but it's still pretty hard to see a weekly ebb and flow. That's not a bad thing necessarily, though. And also, this site has a 3.2% click through rate. That's pretty good. This is kind of actually the balance I usually try to strike. So, for a site that was launched, and this site is only like 4 or 5 months old, this is pretty good. These are all healthy signs. There's nothing erratic going on here. This is the sort of growth that I generally look for and would classify as a success. The site in the image below has 6,000 some clicks. So obviously this site, is a little more exciting than the one above, but it does have a much lower click through rate. So that's the one caveat I'd offer there. And without, the more you do this, the more you start to be able to read these graphs. So for a second, I didn't remember what site this was, but by looking at the click through rate, I know what site this is. It's a niche where I added a lot of content in a short period of time. And that's what's driving down the click through rate. But basically, even though it's taking Google a while to index the backlog of content, it is indexing some percentage, let's say 20% of the content every week as I'm adding new articles. And basically, that's why it's pretty much a steady upward climb. Basically, it's continuing to get that same rate of clicks. And yeah, this is, again, doesn't mean neither of these are indicative of a site that's going to be massive or earn tons of money, but these are the signs I look for. In this case, I would like the click through rate to be a little higher on the second one here. So I'd probably will slow down on the content until this gets to at least 2.5% click through rate. That'd be sort of my benchmark for an early site. But yeah, lots of bloggers have different philosophies on all this, and a lot of them, frankly, don't even care about their click through rate. But if you're asking me, that's, and trying to follow along with some of the case study sites I've done, this is sort of what I use as like my speedometer. And I use the click through rate to determine, is enough content being indexed, and is enough content ultimately ranking in the right positions before making a decision to keep spending time and money. So now we have an example of a stable site. And this is a pretty good example. No site is perfectly stable. Even this one, you'll see a few little aberrations here and there when it comes to some of the weekly highs and lows. But this is pretty stable. The only decrease in this site, it occurs pretty much around the end of December, so Christmas through New Year's, basically. And this is just when internet usage across the board drops. So if we exclude that one seasonal drop for that week or two, the rest of this is pretty smooth.
it's getting somewhere like 2,500, plus clicks a day on average. And this site, I believe, is about 18 months old. So, this is a good example of a site that is doing well. It's got a 2.7% click through rate. So, Google doesn't have a problem with this content in the slightest. Uh, Again, for like uh, a mature-ish site, this is what this is heading toward. So I'd say you could probably safely add more content to this. Um, this is a site I'm actively building, but I only add limited content to, just because it's sort of a one of the more in-depth niches I cover. So the articles are a little harder to write. So here we have two more sites that I would generally say fit the steady profile. Um, the first one having, and they have pretty similar actually amounts of clicks, 35,000 versus 40,000 roughly. But as you can see, the first one gets about twice the impressions, 3 million versus 1.5. So that's why you see that 1.1% click through rate versus 2.7%. So even if the bottom one was getting less traffic, even I know it's getting slightly more, but this is definitely, of the two, the one I'm more interested in. Also worth noting that while both of these are relatively stable for the 3 months here, um, as you can see, there's a slight downward trend on the the site on the top with 35,000 clicks. So this is not a site that was hit, obviously, at least during any update, but basically, yeah, it had done well, and I think there's a little seasonality to the niche. So December was actually a pretty good month, but it's kind of returned to normal. And now we're in the early March, so it's too early to say if the update that we're going through has hit it, but uh, none of these sites have received penalties or any sort of update that I can tell, at least obviously yet. The second one there, the fact that the click through rate is going up is basically indicative of the fact I stopped adding new content to this site toward the end of the year. And so basically, all my existing articles had time to rank and reach sort of their optimal ranking state. Let's say, somewhere at the bottom of the second page on average. And that means like probably half of them are ranking above that, somewhere in the middle of the first page, and half are position 30 to 40. Um, Giving you the average position of 19 or 17.9. So basically, yeah, this is a case where you can see I stop, sometimes you need to let off on the gas. It's not always important to sort of just pummel a site with content. You need to find the next most useful article that you can write. And sometimes it takes a while to figure that out. This, that's the one flaw with having a single site sometimes, is depending on the niche, it can be really hard to find that next must have article. And this site definitely fits that profile. Um, it's doing well. No complaints about this site. But yeah, it's tougher to find new articles at this point. But again, you're starting to see it rank higher in the search engines, basically. And again, it's not like the one above, where it is on a slight upward trend. So they're kind of the opposites of each other. And I'm pretty optimistic about this one. This one's a pretty good site. Um, so far, it hasn't been noticeably hit, but we'll have to see until after March to know for sure. So the fourth type of site trend that you'll see in Google
Search Console is probably the most feared, although it's not always bad. But that's basically Google algorithmic updates and penalties, and occasionally, not as common, but occasionally some unusual event, usually like a one off event. But I included this one as a first example, and this is not my site. This is a reader's site. And as you can see, it was pretty impressive. This thing was a beast. It was doing 80,000 clicks ish a day, in sort of its prime. And yeah, I mean, you can see it has the steep, peaks and valleys, but it's following a pattern. It has a 3% click through rate, 201 million impressions. So people all across the internet are seeing this. Um, and for what it's worth, its average position was fairly high too, meaning they had kind of stabilized this site and probably weren't adding a ton of content toward the end. But this site was unfortunately hit during an update, and yeah, it never recovered. But, and I show this not to scare anyone watching, but just to drive home the point that relying on Google search traffic is definitely risky if that's your primary source of traffic. I mean, really, almost any source of traffic has some risk, but organic search has substantial risk. I'm recording this in March. We're going through the latest core update. I'm sure everybody's very familiar with this point. Now, the reason I also used this example was, even though it looks like this one goes to zero, that's mainly a function of the y-axis being so skewed so high. Really, this thing actually went down to, I believe, like a couple hundred clicks a day. It's just because of that distorted axis that it appears like a flat line toward the end of the graph. But this site was not hit with a manual penalty. Again, if you are hit with a manual penalty, well, that's devastating. At least you kind of know what happened, and there is hope. It's hard, but you can recover from a manual penalty. I haven't had to do it, but I've worked on sites where a team of people did it. And yeah, you can recover from manual penalty. But the reason I use this example is because this is what it'll typically look like if you get hit and get a manual penalty. A normal algorithm update that adversely affects you is going to make your traffic quickly drop somewhere between like 20 and maybe 40%. Or conversely, you might win and see a 20 to 40% increase. But you could see a more devastating blow. But this is a good example, just in that, if you're wondering whether it's an update or a penalty, you can always check in your Google Search Console under security and penalties and see if you have a manual action for either. If not, you know, it's typically something algorithmic, or you might have a problem with your data integration. If I was shown this graph out of context, my first thought would be, okay, did somebody, edit the website and accidentally remove the Google Search Console code? So if you see your graph look like this, especially if it doesn't line up with any known updates or any big search events, I would check this. I've had this happen before, you know, especially if you like let a freelancer or someone edit something on your site, they might unknowingly make this mistake and it might scare you. But in this case, this was a site that was legitimately hit. And again, they're not always this severe. I'm not trying to worry anybody, but I'm just trying to underscore that you have to see a huge drop for it to clearly be an algorithmic update. And it has to basically go straight to zero with a penalty. Um, because, yeah, with a penalty, you're actually de-indexed, meaning your content is no longer ranking, meaning you can't even get a single click. So you literally need to flatline for that to be the case. So to round up this fourth type of Google Search Console pattern you might see, at the top here, we have a site getting about 63,000 clicks during the 3-month period. Now, this is 2022 to 2023. And you'll notice it has a nice steady pattern. Basically, up until March, it would probably classify as a steady site based on what I had said in my previous section. But you can see in March, the traffic spikes, and this site is not mine, but it doesn't have to be for me to understand what happened here. This was right when the 2023 Google Core Update for March came out, and this site shot up. Um, it's also kind of a telltale sign when sometimes there's a lag with impressions. So this has a really low click through rate of 0.3%. But that's probably significantly skewed by the previous month's performance, or basically Google was starting to show it to a lot of people relative to the amount of clicks. And then boom, it started getting real visibility. It probably started winning featured snippets or something like that dramatic. But I add this in here to point out that not all updates are bad. It might feel like that these days, but there are winners that aren't, huge legacy media companies. This site was at its peak pre-update, getting, still less than 1,000 clicks a day, and after it was getting well over 1,000. So this is a good site, but this is basically a site that's like, now if it continues beyond that March point at the same level, it's going to barely qualify for Mediavine at the standard threshold. So this is definitely not some huge, institutional legacy site. This is, the kind of thing you might see happen to your site. And then below, I have another example that's, again, not mine, but it's pretty easy to draw a couple conclusions here. Um, this is another positive one, but it might confuse some people because you see that steady wave pattern leading up to the sudden spike where it goes from 2.5K clicks all the way up to 15K on in basically a matter of days. It has really a single day where it spikes, more than 100%. So and then it kind of returns to the same pattern. So if you see this, I saw this in the context of a case study, and the person, I believe, later discovered that they had gotten a bunch of Google search or Google Discover traffic. And if you see this and you can't figure out why, go into your Google Search Console and check. Uh, if you've never had any Google Discover traffic, you won't even know to look for it sometimes because the tab doesn't appear until you've had some traffic. So if you go into your Google Search Console on the left-hand side at the top, there'll be a tab that says Discover. And when you click on that, if you see a huge, if that tab appears and then you see this huge spike, you'll basically know that that's where this traffic came from. But this is an example of, again, it's definitely an aberration, albeit this is a much better one than a sudden decrease. I hope you found this overview of some examples of Google Search Console data useful. Um, I Most of these were obviously my sites. I was sharing some personal insights, but thanks to the readers who submitted a few to help with some of the more less common case studies. Uh, but in general, there's only so much you can do to manage risk against these catastrophic or major events. Most of the time, you're checking Google Search Console. It's to make sure that your site is generally healthy, that there's no security issues, that your pages are indexing properly, and basically that, yeah, you have a good click-through rate. Those are the things I would focus on. If your pages are indexing, let's say 80% or more of the total submitted pages, and you have above a 2.5%, 3% click-through rate, chances are your site will keep growing. At what interval, it's impossible to say. That will be dependent on when the next core update is, because sometimes your site needs to be completely reclassified to see major growth, especially if you're a more mature site and you're hoping for, say, more than a 10%, 20% increase in traffic. But if you like this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel, and I'll be putting out more content like this, hopefully, that you'll find useful. If you have any questions, just leave a comment and I'll do my best to get back to you. If you need to reach out to me directly, you can do so through my website, bloggingguide.com, or you can reach out to me on social media at Casey Botticello.